Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for putting another great conference. It's always a pleasure to be back in St. Louis and to present here. We also appreciate having the paper on the program. We very much look forward to your feedback, looking forward to Anne's feedback and Or's feedback, as well as the audience's. This is the second paper on CFPB. We're going to also be looking at discipline. Before I say anything else, I have a bunch of courses here. Jeffrey Drew is a very talented PhD student at Wharton. Andrea Paslaka is currently at Georgetown. Laszlo Sandor is at CFPB, and Rajesh Vijayaraghavan is at University of British Columbia. And because a number of us, or two of us, are affiliated with regulatory institutions, these are our views, not the views of the Federal Reserve Board, Federal Reserve System, and CFPB. So in this paper, we try to kind of study something very similar to what Kathy was talking about. She set the scene for me. But we're going to look at what happens when consumer complaints are disclosed, whether there's any reaction, disciplining action coming from depositors. So we've talked a little bit about that yesterday, about depositor-bearing runs. And so we're not going to look at runs, but we're going to try to understand whether disclosing information about consumer complaints could still provide some disciplining mechanism by providing this information about something that could be amiss with a bank. So information disclosure in literature always is discussed. It's played an important role. It could provide information. And market discipline in banking comes from depositors, but it could also come from the capital market. But of course, if you see a decline in deposits, that could lead to financial stability, that could also affect lending. So our question is to understand whether information disclosure provides any impact on banks. So CFPB has been around since 2011. It provides oversight of consumer markets. We've just heard about that it has oversight over financial institutions, but also kind of banks, but non-banks. It's dedicated to consumer finance. It discloses and investigates consumer complaints. It's a very important part of what they do. And they refer complaints to other regulators if they're not the regulator who is in charge. And the question is it going to be effective? We just heard about how disclosure might have been ineffective. Let's see if we find something on the depositor side. So there are three questions that we're after. First is, do depositors respond to this information? The second one, if depositors respond, conditional on the response, do banks do anything about it? Do they try to attract deposits? And finally, we're still working on this piece. We're going to do some textual analysis of what is actually in those complaints, try to understand whether it's the disclosure per se, knowing that your bank has complaints, versus the actual content, what it is that consumers are complaining about that's going to matter for depositors. I'm not going to go through related literature, but I'll tell you that there's a lot of research on market discipline in particular, and there's some research on this CFPB, and we try to merge those two literatures together and provide some insights of what happened when you disclose information. So you know where CFPB has been around since the introduction of the Dodd-Frank Act back in 2010. It began operations in 2011. It has authority over banks and non-banks, and it has powers in three specific areas: rulemaking, supervision and examination, and enforcement. And specifically for us, what is going to be important is who falls under the supervisory authority of CFPB. These are going to banks above the 10 billion threshold. We've talked about thresholds quite a bit over the last 2 days. And you have to be above the threshold for 4 consecutive quarters. Then you're going to be subject to CFPB oversight. Well, we find in the database that there are complaints for banks that are smaller than that threshold, and that allows us to study the impact. So the data has been disclosed since 2011. Starting from 2015, CFPB discloses not just the actual instance of a complaint and which kind of product it's about, but also the content of complaints. The way that this information is being used, if you as a consumer put a complaint to CFPB, CFPB receives those complaints, they have someone who reviews them, and they send it to the appropriate institution, or they forward it to the relevant regulator. And then the institution has to reply within 15 days. And either within those 15 days or sooner, if the response comes sooner, the information about this complaint is going to be posted on CFPB's website. And so the idea is to provide timely information to consumers to be able to give them information to make decisions. So that would hopefully increases transparency and efficiency. If you were to search for your bank on the website, you can go to CFPB's website. There's a search engine, and as you can see, as of July, this last time we updated this page, there were over 5 million complaints. At this point, when I checked last night, there were close to 6 million complaints. A lot of these complaints are about credit cards and fraud, so not all of them are going to be specific to banks. I wanted to give you two snapshots of examples. There's a lot of text, but I wanted you to think about the content. So the first example is someone who is complaining about the fact that there was fraudulent activity on their account. They went to their bank and nothing happened. So they believe that the bank should return the $400 that they lost as a result. The second complaint is much longer, and it didn't fit on the entire slide, so I actually cut it. But what I wanted to show here is that there is some level of sophistication in terms of what consumers could say. So this consumer is actually citing different types of regulation because they believe when they deposit a cashier check, they should have got their funds sooner, and they want CFPB to investigate it. So this is the kind of information, the content that we have access to. All right, how prevalent are those complaints? In our sample, which is between 2011 and 2020, we have about a third of US counties with instances of their banks receiving complaints. So it's across the US, but you will see that metropolitan areas, and I'll show you kind of a zoom-in picture, are the ones where you have more banks and also you receive more complaints, or CFPB receives more complaints. In particular, Chicago, LA, New York, and Miami are the places where there are a lot of consumer complaints. I wanted to also kind of follow on the discussion that we've had. Is there attention to this information? So what happens when we know certain activities happened? So here is an example of Wells Fargo. We all have heard about the creation of fake accounts. That was definitely fraudulent activities. And before the news hit in September of 2016, you can see an increase in complaints specific to these accounts. So this is a useful tool for CFPB to see what activity is happening there. Another example is Citibank. So Citibank had two big investigations. One was when they started their American Airlines rewards program. They promised a certain number of miles, but a lot of consumers opening those credit card accounts did not receive those miles. And so they complained. And there were even forums that picked this up and encouraged consumers to complain and have this information disclosed. And second one is treatment of pandemic. There was a lot of complaints that Citi received for how they were using their credit cards facilities for consumers who were facing difficulties during the pandemic. One more picture I wanted to show you is the types of complaints. So there are a lot of different products, in particular 11 categories of products that CFPB collects information on. We just heard about mortgages. So mortgages are an important part of it, but it's only a subset of complaints. And so what we're trying to add in terms of our research is trying to understand, given all these different types of products that are potentially being complained about, is there a response from depositors? We're going to use a number of different data sets that we connect together. Because of being at the board and my co-author being at CFPB, we have access to the confidential data in addition to the one that's publicly disclosed. And that's important because consumers, when they provide the narrative, they opt in for this to be disclosed or not. So if a consumer says, I do not want this narrative to be disclosed, the CFPB will receive it and will review it, but it's not going to be in the public domain. So we get access to both. And because narratives only started being disclosed in 2015, that gives us kind of time to look back to 2012 when they first started being disclosed to see whether it's the disclosure per se of something about the bank or the content of disclosure that matters. And we connect it to a number of different data sources to be able to take into account information about the local economic conditions as well as market and mortgage conditions. So I'm showing this graph here because we're going to narrowly focus on banks that are around the 10 billion threshold, crossing in and out to be able to kind of use identification. So on average, we'll have about 134 banks in our sample in a given quarter. And you will see that, of course, the largest banks are the ones that are receiving the largest number of complaints. Not surprising, they have a much bigger footprint, and you would expect them to have more complaints. But still, within that sample, what I wanted you to show that on CFPB's, in the CFPB's database, we still have complaints even for smaller banks that are being submitted to CFPB on their website. So, as I already mentioned, we look at banks within this threshold between 1 and 25 billion. We go back in history to be able to look at some performance before the introduction of CFPB's consumer complaints database. And then we specifically focus on institutions that are subject to CFPB supervision, so above 10 billion, and not being members of or being part of the holding company that is large and subject to additional regulatory. So let me just highlight what happens with disclosure. So we first wanted to know, is it material? to see whether there's any market reaction in the equity market. For a subset of our banks that are publicly listed, we wanted to see if there's anything happening in the equity market. We have some muted responses. In particular, we see there's a widening of bid-ask spread, and academic literature usually refers to this as an increase in uncertainty. That's why you have the widening of the spread. And there's also increase in trading volume when complaints are being disclosed. And trading volume usually is associated with increase in disagreements. So there's some uncertainty about the future performance of a bank when complaints about those banks are disclosed. Next, we look at what happens to depositors. So we find that depositors seem to react. There's some reaction in decline in deposits. And in particular, this reaction is more prevalent, more significant, if the bank receives a large number of complaints. And then we also want to see what happens in the mortgage market, and we find that the application share reduces for banks that receive complaints. So it's a little bit different from what Kathy was talking about, because in our case, we just look at are they receiving more or less applications. I'll show you a couple of tables. So the first one is to highlight that the complaints that are specific to bank accounts are the ones that seem to be invoking a more significant reaction from banks that are subject to CFPB oversight when complaints about those banks are disclosed. So this is a share of complaints about customer accounts that's above median, and we see that here the result is statistically significant throughout. Next, we also see what banks do. So they seem to be losing some deposits. Do they engage in any way of raising deposits? That is difficult to demonstrate. One way we can show some effect is to look at whether they are trying to attract deposits by paying higher rates on longer-term deposits, such as CD rates. And this is precisely what we find. We find that if banks are receiving complaints, they seem to be increasing their CD rates starting from the 6 months to 60 months product. So that suggests that banks are trying to potentially replace the deposits they might be losing as a result of this disclosure. And that is also true in terms of the intensity of disclosure. The more complaints they have, the more likely they are to increase rates. And here we have the CD rates for a 12 months product. So with that, we wanted to understand a little bit more about the content of disclosure. And here we do two different types of textual analysis. One is trying to understand the sentiment using the technology that was created by Google based on and trained on Reddit to be able to understand the emotions and sentiment. Of course, we are looking at complaints, so our prior was they are going to be negative by definition, and of course the disappointment is the most common sentiment here. So there seems to be some effect from this. But then we also want to understand the topics. I've told you a little bit about the importance of understanding what is in those complaints. And so we use another technique to classify the most common themes. We know what consumers are complaining about, we know the product, but we wanted to be able to see if we can infer anything from the actual text or content of disclosures. And so this is precisely what we do. We create 5 different topics, and here we compare what we can see in the publicly disclosed data set as well as what we see in the private database that's only available to CFPB. So here are the 5 topics that we come up with using this natural language processes technique. So these are bigrams, so 2 pairs of words. The first topic deals with credit cards. You see that credit cards appear quite a lot. So the most common are credit reports. So this is complaints about consumers' credit reports from credit bureaus. The second one is more about the customer service. And the third one is things like paying late fees. The last 2 topics are more about specifically topic 5 about actual accounts and topic 4 about loan modifications. When we do the same type of analysis with the confidential data, we find slightly different results. And so the reason why the complaints might be different is because, of course, consumers could opt out from not having the content disclosed. We can go back in time further, and so we can get a little bit more information. So let me show those topics. I don't have much time left. So I'll just give you this picture and kind of wrap up. So here, a little bit hard to see, but we still have credit cards coming in as topics 1 and 2, but there's a little bit more variation. Particular topics 4 and 5 are now first being specific to student loans, which we didn't see in the previous categorization of topics. And the second one is loan modifications, but now it deals with mortgages. So there is some variation, and this is what we will use in our additional analysis. I'm not going to go through this, but what we're trying to show is now to differentiate this instance of complaints versus the content of complaints to be able to understand what is in those results. And in the last 40 seconds that I have left, let me just summarize what this paper is about. So we try to understand whether disclosing consumer complaints about their financial service providers, in particular banks, has any impact on banks' service provision. In particular, we look at, is it material? We find that there's some evidence in the stock market. We find there's some evidence in depositors' response. We try to understand what banks do in response. They seem to try to attract longer-term deposits by increasing rates on those long-term deposits. And we also find that there is some evidence of how this content is being perceived. In particular, we see results of negative emotions. And we also find that it's the content that seems to be driving some of the results. Potential policy implications, well, this information is being disclosed publicly. It's being used by the regulator. Not a lot of it is leading to enforcement actions, but perhaps there is still some market discipline to be seen from consumers. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the feedback.